I stood on the dock watching investors in suits sip champagne on my lakefront. The Homeowners Association had tried to take control, but they didn't realize they'd built their dream resort on land I still owned. And now, I was about to sell it all for billions. The evening sun glinted off the new glass-fronted lodge they'd constructed at the water's edge. Between the manicured gardens and the fleet of rental boats, they'd transformed my quiet family property into something from a luxury travel magazine. I smiled as I watched the Homeowners Association president proudly giving tours to potential investors, completely unaware that in less than 24 hours, none of this would belong to them anymore. The breeze carried fragments of conversation across the water, talk of expansion plans, membership tiers, and projected revenue streams. These were the same people who had once called my humble cabin an aesthetic violation and my natural shoreline unkempt. Now they served canapes and vintage champagne on floating platforms anchored to my lakebed. I adjusted the wide brim of my sun hat, ensuring they wouldn't recognize me from this distance, not that they would anyway. To them, I had always been invisible, except when I stood in their way. Today, though, I was merely gathering intelligence, confirming that everything was proceeding according to plan. Tomorrow, I would become impossible to ignore. It all started 5 years ago when I inherited this pristine lake property from my grandfather. He had purchased it back in the 1960s, long before the surrounding valley became developed with high-end homes. The lake itself was deep, crystal clear, and fed by natural springs. Exactly the kind of natural feature that sends property values soaring. When grandfather passed away, he left me detailed property records showing that our family owned not just the modest cabin on the North Shore, but the entire lake and 100 feet of shoreline around its complete circumference. I cherished this inheritance not for its monetary value, but for the peaceful retreat it provided from my hectic city life. Grandfather had been meticulous about maintaining the legal boundaries of our property. As development crept closer to our secluded paradise in the 1990s, he hired surveyors to clearly mark and document our land. "Rebecca," he would tell me during our summer fishing trips, "never let anyone convince you this water belongs to anyone but our family." He showed me the original deed, with boundaries defined by natural landmarks, the large granite outcropping on the eastern shore, the ancient oak that marked the northwest corner, the natural spring that fed the lake from the south. When developers approached him with offers to buy portions of the shoreline, he refused every time, even as the sums grew more substantial. "Some things are beyond price," he would say, gazing out at the sunset reflected on the water. "This place keeps our family's memories alive." After his passing, I discovered journals detailing every interaction he'd had with developers and, later, with the Homeowners Association that formed as the surrounding ridgeline filled with luxury homes. He documented their increasingly aggressive tactics, from friendly offers to thinly veiled threats about eminent domain and community necessity. The last entry, written just months before his death, revealed that he had consulted with environmental lawyers to establish additional protections for the lake. "I worry what will happen when I'm gone," he wrote. "Rebecca appreciates this place, but she hasn't faced the kind of pressure these people can exert. I've done what I can to fortify our position legally. The rest will be up to her." Reading those words after the funeral, I made a silent promise to honor his vigilance. As the surrounding valley developed over the decades, an exclusive neighborhood association formed. They called themselves the Ridgeline Estates, and their annual fees were more than what most people paid for their mortgages. I lived outside their boundaries and technically wasn't subject to their rules, but that didn't stop them from constantly sending me letters about my eyesore of a cabin and how my unmanicured natural shoreline was affecting their property values. I ignored them. After all, the lake was mine, and I preferred the natural beauty of cattails and water lilies to the sterile perfection of their chemically treated lawns. The Ridgeline Estates marketed itself as the premier living destination in the county. Their promotional materials featured sweeping aerial photographs showcasing the exclusive lakefront views from their ridge-perched mansions. They never mentioned that the lake itself wasn't part of their property, a convenient omission that allowed them to charge premium prices for lots with lake access. Their community guidelines ran to over 100 pages, dictating everything from acceptable exterior paint colors to the permissible height of garden ornaments. Enforcement was handled by what residents jokingly called the appearance police. Retired executives who patrolled in golf carts, documenting violations with digital cameras and issuing fines. My first personal encounter with the Homeowners Association came during my second summer at the lake. I had invited friends to celebrate Independence Day with a small barbecue at the cabin. We were enjoying a peaceful afternoon when 3 members of the association board arrived uninvited, marching down my private path as if they owned it. The leader, a silver-haired man named Richard Blackwood, introduced himself as the Community Standards Liaison before informing me that my gathering was generating excessive noise that violated community tranquility guidelines. When I pointed out that my property wasn't part of their jurisdiction, he smiled condescendingly. "Perhaps not technically," he conceded, "but we all share this valley and your activities impact our residents' enjoyment of their homes." He handed me a copy of their noise regulations and suggested I voluntarily comply out of courtesy. I thanked him for his concern, placed the document in our fire pit, and continued our celebration long into the evening. The real trouble began during a particularly dry summer, when water became a precious commodity. The Homeowners Association, led by a former corporate executive named Margaret Thornton, held an emergency meeting about securing water rights for their community. I wasn't invited, but a sympathetic neighbor slipped me the minutes afterward. According to their plans, my grandfather's lake was about to become their solution. Margaret had consulted with a development attorney who claimed there were zoning loopholes they could exploit to gain access to my water. They called it community resource reclamation. I called it theft. My ally within the Ridgeline community was Eleanor Winters, a retired environmental lawyer who had purchased her home before the association became so restrictive. She had fought her own battles against the board's overreach and recognized the dangerous pattern in their behavior. "They've been planning this for years," she explained over tea on my porch. The meeting minutes spread between us. First, they tried to regulate access to the lake by claiming environmental concerns. When that failed, they attempted to purchase shoreline parcels from individual owners. Now they're moving to their endgame, exploiting drought conditions to claim necessity. She pointed to a section where Margaret had referenced a century-old county statute regarding water access during emergency conditions. They're building a legal framework to justify taking what they've always wanted. Eleanor advised me to document everything and prepare for a prolonged conflict. Margaret didn't get to be chief executive officer of a multinational corporation by accepting defeat gracefully, she warned. She views obstacles as challenges to overcome, not boundaries to respect. According to Eleanor, Margaret had specifically purchased a home in Ridgeline Estates after satellite images showed its proximity to our lake. Within 6 months of moving in, she had been elected board president on a platform promising to enhance community water features and recreational opportunities. The minutes Eleanor shared revealed the board's internal discussions, including an assessment of what they called my resistance threshold, how much pressure they believed I could withstand before surrendering my rights. What troubled me most was the calculated nature of their approach. This wasn't a misunderstanding between neighbors or an impulsive overreach. The meeting minutes outlined a multi-phase strategy spanning years, with contingency plans for various responses I might make. They had researched my financial situation, my job security, and even my family connections, looking for leverage points. One particularly disturbing note mentioned using county environmental regulations to potentially condemn my cabin if I proved excessively uncooperative. They had wargamed scenarios where I might seek legal representation and identified methods to prolong any litigation until my resources were exhausted. Reading through their cold assessment of how to systematically deprive me of my property rights, I realized I wasn't facing merely entitled neighbors, but a coordinated campaign, orchestrated by people who viewed the world as something to be acquired rather than shared. Within weeks, heavy machinery appeared at the southern edge of my lake. I confronted the work crew, property deed in hand, but they simply directed me to speak with the Homeowners Association. When I called Margaret Thornton, she answered, with the practiced smoothness of someone used to getting her way. "Oh, Rebecca, we've been meaning to discuss this with you," she said, with false warmth. "We're simply building some community amenities. The county approved everything. If you have concerns, our attorneys would be happy to walk you through the permits." The dismissal in her tone was clear. This was happening whether I approved or not. The next morning I drove to the county permits office and requested copies of all approvals related to my property. The clerk, a weary-looking man with decades of bureaucratic experience etched into his face, took nearly an hour to locate the relevant files. "This is unusual," he muttered, spreading the documents across the counter. "Multiple departmental approvals, expedited processing, special consideration notations." He pointed to signatures from the county commissioner, zoning board director, and the environmental impact assessment team, all dated within days of each other, a process that typically took months. When I asked how this was possible, he glanced around before leaning closer. The approvals came from above, way above my pay grade. He tapped a notation indicating that the permits had been classified as a Community Resilience Initiative, a designation created after recent regional water shortages to fast-track infrastructure projects. The permits themselves revealed a masterpiece of bureaucratic maneuvering. While they authorized construction of what was described as watershed management infrastructure and community disaster resilience facilities, the actual blueprints detailed boat docks, a clubhouse, swimming areas, and landscaped gardens. The environmental impact statement, usually a rigorous document for lakefront development, was a mere 3 pages, most of which praised the ecological benefits of replacing natural shoreline with managed recreational spaces. Most concerning was the jurisdictional classification. The Homeowners Association had somehow convinced county officials to designate their construction as an extension of existing community infrastructure, bypassing requirements for landowner approval that would normally apply to private property development. When I attempted to file an objection with the zoning board, I encountered another wall of resistance. The clerk informed me that the appeal window had closed. Apparently, notices had been posted in the county newspaper's classified section for the required 2 weeks. When I pointed out that as the property owner I should have received direct notification, she directed me to an obscure subsection of the county code that made exceptions for community emergency response infrastructure. My growing frustration must have been evident, as she lowered her voice and added, "Look, if I were you, I'd get a lawyer who specializes in property rights. This isn't normal." She glanced meaningfully toward a framed photograph on the wall showing Margaret Thornton cutting a ribbon at the county's new administrative building, a facility funded largely by donations from Ridgeline residents. I contacted 3 different property attorneys that week. Each gave me the same frustrating news. Fighting the Homeowners Association would be an uphill battle. They had influential connections with the county zoning board, deep pockets for legal fees, and the patience to drag things out until I couldn't afford to continue. One lawyer examined my deed closely, however, and pointed out something crucial. While the Homeowners Association might have secured permits to build structures near the lake, they couldn't actually claim ownership of the land beneath those structures without my explicit agreement. This detail would become my secret weapon. The attorney who identified this critical point was Victor Mendez, a property rights specialist who had tangled with aggressive development interests throughout his 30-year career. Unlike the other lawyers who seemed intimidated by the Homeowners Association's resources, Victor viewed them with the weariness of someone who had seen their tactics before. "They're executing a classic land grab strategy," he explained, spreading my grandfather's property documents across his desk. "First, create regulatory complexity. Second, exploit emergency provisions. Third, establish physical presence through construction. Fourth, claim ownership through usage rights and improvements." He tapped his finger on my deed's description of the property boundaries. "But they've missed something fundamental. In this state, riparian rights follow strict historical precedent. Your grandfather's foresight in registering the lakebed itself as part of the property is their Achilles heel. Victor explained that while the Homeowners Association had manipulated the permit process to allow construction, they had focused entirely on securing building rights rather than establishing ownership transfer. "It's like building a house on someone else's foundation," he said. "The structure might be yours, but the land remains theirs." He outlined two possible strategies: an immediate injunction to halt construction, or a longer-term approach that would allow the Homeowners Association to complete their projects before asserting my ownership rights. The first approach would involve years of costly litigation with uncertain outcomes. The second would require patience, but could potentially result in taking possession of millions of dollars worth of improvements. "It's risky," he admitted. "You'll need to document everything without revealing your strategy, and you'll have to endure their encroachment for years while they dig themselves deeper into this legal trap." When I asked why the Homeowners Association's attorneys wouldn't have identified this vulnerability, Victor smiled knowingly. "Corporate attorneys are trained to secure permissions and overcome regulatory obstacles. They excel at finding loopholes in zoning and building codes, but they often overlook the fundamentals of property law, especially in rural areas with historical deeds." He showed me annotations in my grandfather's deed that referenced 19th century water rights doctrines still recognized by state courts. These old property rights were established when water was essential for agriculture and basic survival. They were written to prevent precisely this kind of appropriation by powerful interests. He recommended I maintain detailed records of every communication and construction development, while quietly reinforcing my ownership claims through property tax payments and annual boundary confirmations with the county assessor's office. Before I left his office, Victor offered one final piece of advice that would prove invaluable. "Don't try to stop them," he said. "Let them build. Let them invest. Let them create value on your land, but document everything, every square foot of improvement, every dollar of investment, because eventually you'll need to establish the true value of what they've constructed without permission." When I asked how much I owed him for the consultation, he named a modest figure and added, "I'll be available when you're ready to make your move. Just don't wait too long. These rights can be eroded through inaction." As I wrote the check, I noticed a framed newspaper article on his wall describing his successful defense of a family farm against a shopping mall development. The headline read, "David Defeats Goliath in Property Rights Battle." I hoped my story might someday warrant similar recognition. Over the next 2 years, I watched in quiet fury as they transformed my peaceful lakefront into a resort-style playground for the wealthy. First came the boathouse and dock, an impressive timber structure with space for 20 high-end motorboats and pontoons. Next was the Lakeside Lodge, a 3-story building with floor-to-ceiling windows, stone fireplaces, and a restaurant serving overpriced meals on a deck overlooking the water. They added a beach area, with imported white sand, walking trails with romantic lighting, and even a small marina for yacht owners. Throughout it all, I received formal notices about community improvements that would enhance everyone's property values, as if that somehow justified their takeover. Following Victor's advice, I meticulously documented every phase of construction. I purchased a professional-grade camera and drone to capture aerial footage of the development's progress. On weekends, I hiked around the perimeter of the lake, photographing each new addition from multiple angles and recording GPS coordinates. I maintained a detailed spreadsheet tracking construction milestones, materials used, and estimated costs based on industry standards. Through public records requests, I obtained copies of contracts between the Homeowners Association and their construction companies, architectural firms, and landscapers. When possible, I collected discarded construction plans from worksite dumpsters, giving me insights into their complete vision for my property. The scale of their investment was staggering, The boathouse alone cost over $3 million, with exotic hardwoods imported from Southeast Asia and custom brass fixtures. The lakeside lodge, designed by an internationally renowned architect, featured hand-carved stone details, custom furniture, and a kitchen equipped with commercial-grade appliances capable of serving hundreds of guests. The landscaping transformed natural wetlands into manicured gardens with rare ornamental plants requiring constant maintenance. A team of groundskeepers was hired to manage the property year-round, and security personnel patrolled the premises day and night. I calculated that the Homeowners Association was spending nearly $50,000 weekly just on maintenance costs. Most revealing were the minutes from their finance committee meetings, which Eleanor continued to share with me. The board had initially budgeted $12 million for the entire project, but had already exceeded $20 million by the midpoint. Rather than scaling back, Margaret convinced the members to approve additional assessments, arguing that the enhanced facilities would yield proportional increases in property values. "This isn't just an amenity," she told the committee according to the transcripts. "It's an investment that will appreciate continuously. Once we establish our usage rights through continuous occupation and improvement, we'll have effectively acquired a 100-acre lake for pennies on the dollar." The finance committee projected that the completed resort would increase Ridgeline property values by an average of 30%, translating to hundreds of millions in collective property value increases across the community. Each time I raised objections, the response grew more threatening. "We understand your concerns," their form letters would say, "but our legal team has confirmed that these improvements fall within proper use of community recreational easements." When I pointed out that no such easement existed, they would reference obscure county codes and zoning regulations that, according to them, superseded my property rights. At one particularly heated community meeting, Margaret Thornton had security escort me out when I tried to address the group about the illegality of their actions. "Some people just can't see the bigger picture," she told the assembled homeowners as I was removed. "Progress requires vision, and unfortunately, not everyone shares ours." Their tactics soon escalated beyond bureaucratic obstruction to more personal forms of pressure. Anonymous complaints began appearing in my workplace suggestion box, questioning my professionalism and commitment. My supervisor, normally supportive, called me into his office to discuss concerns about external distractions affecting your performance. When I explained the situation, he seemed sympathetic but warned that our company's largest client was a corporation where Margaret Thornton served on the board of directors. "Just be careful," he advised uncomfortably. "Corporate politics can spill over in unexpected ways." Shortly afterward, my performance reviews, previously excellent, began noting communication issues and resistance to collaborative projects. The pressure extended to my personal life as well. Deliveries to my cabin were mysteriously delayed or rerouted. Service providers suddenly became unavailable, with one plumber candidly admitting that working on my property might cost him valuable contracts with Ridgeline residents. My internet service experienced frequent outages, and when technicians responded, they found evidence of physical tampering with the connection box located near the community access road. Most disturbingly, several potential romantic relationships cooled suddenly after my dates were approached by concerned community members, warning them about my problematic behavior and ongoing legal troubles. Eleanor Winters, my only ally within Ridgeline, faced similar intimidation. After continuing to provide me with information about board activities, she found herself subject to a barrage of violation notices for trivial infractions of community guidelines. Her garden, previously featured in regional home magazines, was deemed inconsistent with community standards due to the height of certain perennials. The paint color of her home, approved years earlier, was suddenly deemed non-compliant with updated color schemes. When she spoke out at meetings, her microphone would mysteriously malfunction. Eventually, she emailed me to say she could no longer openly communicate. "They're watching too closely," she wrote. "But don't think for a moment that I've stopped documenting everything. When the time comes, I'll stand with you." Attached to her email was a folder containing recordings of private conversations among board members discussing strategies to neutralize the lake problem once and for all. What Margaret and her board didn't realize was that I had developed a vision of my own. Instead of continuing to fight them directly, I made what appeared to be a strategic retreat. I stopped attending their meetings. I no longer confronted their construction crews. I even renovated my cabin to meet their aesthetic standards, painting it the approved lakeside blue from their color palette. The Homeowners Association interpreted my compliance as surrender. In reality, I was simply waiting for them to complete the trap they were building for themselves. My apparent capitulation was carefully orchestrated. I consulted with Victor Mendez about each concession, ensuring that none of my actions could be interpreted as granting permission or surrendering ownership rights. We drafted careful responses to Homeowners Association communications that acknowledged receipt without accepting their legal assertions. When I repainted my cabin, I first filed a declaration with the county recorder specifying that the aesthetic changes were being made under duress and did not constitute acceptance of ridgeline authority over my property. When construction crews needed to access my land to complete shoreline projects, I provided written statements allowing temporary access for specific purposes while explicitly reserving all ownership rights. Behind this facade of grudging cooperation, I intensified my documentation efforts. I hired a forensic accountant to analyze the public financial records of the Homeowners Association, tracking how member fees were being allocated to the lake development. The findings were illuminating. The board had shifted funds from essential infrastructure maintenance to support their ambitious lake project, neglecting road repairs and security systems within their own community. The accountant also identified concerning patterns in vendor selection, with contracts frequently awarded to companies with personal connections to board members, often at rates significantly above market value. These records would prove invaluable in demonstrating the board's breach of fiduciary duty to its members. I also began cultivating relationships with individuals who might prove useful when the time came to act. I reconnected with former university classmates who had entered commercial real estate development, meeting them for lunch in nearby cities to discuss hypothetical investment opportunities and recreational properties. Without revealing my specific situation, I gathered insights about market valuations for luxury resorts, potential commercial buyers, and financing structures for large property transactions. I attended real estate investment seminars, building a network of contacts in the luxury property market and learning the language of high-end development. While Margaret and her board believed I had surrendered, I was assembling the knowledge and connections that would eventually unravel their plans. Perhaps most importantly, I developed my patience. Each morning I would sit on my dock, watching construction vehicles arrive and workers transform my peaceful sanctuary into something unrecognizable. Rather than fueling my anger, I channeled these observations into detailed notes about construction methods, materials used, and approximate costs. I reminded myself that each extravagant addition, the imported marble for the lodge bathroom, the handcrafted boathouse doors, the underwater lighting system for evening swimmers, was another investment the Homeowners Association was making in my property. Every nail driven, every foundation poured, every exotic plant installed was increasing the value of an asset they would never own. Like a chess player watching an opponent make a fatal error but maintaining a neutral expression, I observed their expensive miscalculation with calculated restraint. While they busied themselves with construction, I consulted quietly with commercial real estate experts. We meticulously documented every improvement the Homeowners Association made to my property, calculating the increasing value of the land with each addition. I had geological surveys conducted to assess the water quality and volume of the natural springs feeding the lake. I researched luxury resort valuations and identified potential commercial buyers who might be interested in acquiring a turnkey lakefront property. Most importantly, I had my original deed reviewed and confirmed by the state's top property rights attorney, who agreed that despite the Homeowners Association's clever maneuvering, they had never actually secured legal ownership of the land itself. The development took 3 years to complete, The Homeowners Association spent over $30 million transforming my modest lakefront into what they proudly called the Peninsula Resort and Spa. They held a grand opening gala with local celebrities, politicians, and media coverage. Membership fees for residents doubled to maintain the new facilities, but no one complained. Property values in the Ridgeline estates had already increased by 40% based on the new amenities. In her opening speech, broadcast on local news, Margaret Thornton claimed the resort represented the perfect marriage of natural beauty and human ingenuity. She neglected to mention that this marriage lacked the consent of one very important party, me, the actual owner of the property. 1 week after their grand opening, I listed the entire lake property, including all structures and improvements, with an exclusive commercial real estate broker specializing in luxury resort properties. The asking price, $3 billion, made headlines in the financial press. Untapped luxury opportunity. Private lake resort near metropolitan area hits market, read the Wall Street Journal article. Within days, interested parties from around the world were contacting my broker. When word reached the Homeowners Association, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Margaret Thornton appeared at my door, flanked by 2 attorneys and the entire board. "This is outrageous," she fumed, thrusting a copy of the listing toward me. "You have no right to sell community property. We'll file an injunction immediately." I invited them inside, an act of hospitality that momentarily confused them. On my dining table, I had laid out copies of my original deed, the county property records, and a legal opinion from the state's top property rights attorney. "Please, have a seat," I offered. "I believe you'll find these documents enlightening. While you secured permits to build on this land, you never actually acquired ownership of it. Everything the Homeowners Association constructed sits on property that still legally belongs to me." The color drained from Margaret's face as her attorneys reviewed the documents. One leaned over and whispered something in her ear, causing her expression to shift from anger to alarm. "This is some kind of trick," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "We've invested millions in these facilities. The county approved every permit." I nodded sympathetically. "Yes, you did invest millions in improvements to my property. The permits allowed you to build, but they didn't transfer ownership. It's an unfortunate oversight on your part, but not one that changes the legal reality." The second attorney was now frantically making phone calls, stepping outside to speak in hushed tones. What followed was a desperate attempt by the Homeowners Association to regain control of the situation. They filed emergency injunctions, appealed to county officials, and even attempted to claim adverse possession, a legal doctrine that would have required them to have openly used the property for many more years than they had. Each effort failed. The property records were clear, and my ownership was indisputable. In a particularly satisfying turn of events, their own meticulous documentation of the improvements, intended to justify the increased Homeowners Association fees, now served as evidence of how much value they had added to my property. As the legal reality sank in, panic spread through the Ridgeline estates. Homeowners who had paid premium prices for lake access now faced the prospect of losing that access entirely. Those who had invested in the construction through increased fees realized their money had essentially been donated to improve someone else's property. The Homeowners Association board members, who had so confidently assured everyone of their legal standing, now faced potential personal liability for their misrepresentation. The community that had once been so united in its vision now fractured along lines of blame and recrimination. Meanwhile, interest in the property continued to grow. 3 major luxury hotel chains sent representatives to tour the facilities. A famous billionaire tech entrepreneur flew in by helicopter to view the property personally. An international resort conglomerate submitted a formal letter of interest. Each potential buyer was impressed not just by the natural beauty of the lake, but by the quality of the infrastructure already in place. "It's rare to find a property this well developed yet untapped in terms of commercial potential," commented one executive. "The current facilities are excellent, but a proper commercial operation could easily generate 10 times the current usage value." 2 months after listing the property, I received 3 official offers. The lowest was for $2.5 billion, still an astronomical sum for property that had been valued at less than $1 million before the Homeowners Association began their improvements. The highest bid, from Global Resorts International, was for $4.2 billion, with conditions. They wanted exclusive rights to the property, including the ability to restrict access to paying guests only. This would effectively cut off all residents of the Ridgeline Estates from the lake and facilities they had funded. It was exactly the outcome the Homeowners Association had feared most. In a last-ditch effort to prevent the sale, Margaret Thornton arranged a community-wide meeting and invited me to attend. The clubhouse was packed with angry homeowners, many of whom were learning the full details of the situation for the first time. Margaret attempted to present a united front, but the cracks in her leadership were evident. "We're prepared to make you a generous offer for the property," she announced, revealing that they had secured emergency financing to offer me $1 billion. A substantial sum, but far less than the commercial bids I'd received. This would allow us to maintain the community nature of the facilities while fairly compensating you for the land. I listened politely to their proposal, waited for the murmurs in the room to quiet, and then approached the microphone. "I appreciate your offer," I began, "and I understand this is a difficult situation for everyone involved. However, I need to clarify something important. This predicament didn't arise because I changed the rules. It arose because the Homeowners Association chose to build on land they didn't own. Despite my repeated warnings, the room grew uncomfortably silent. For years, I was told my concerns didn't matter. I was excluded from decisions about my own property. I was even physically removed from meetings when I tried to assert my rights." I looked directly at Margaret, whose expression had hardened into a mask. "So while I appreciate the offer, I've already accepted the bid from Global Resorts International." The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. People began shouting questions about access rights and property values. Some demanded Margaret's resignation on the spot, others threatened new lawsuits, though it wasn't clear who they intended to sue. Through it all, I maintained my composure, explaining that while I sympathized with homeowners who had been misled, my decision was final. As I left the clubhouse that evening, I overheard one elderly resident summarizing the situation perfectly. "They built a castle on someone else's land, and now they're surprised the landowner wants to keep the castle." The sale closed with remarkable speed, giving the magnitude of the transaction. Global Resorts International paid the full $4.2 billion, making me one of the wealthiest private individuals in the state overnight. As part of the agreement, they granted me lifetime usage rights to the facilities, though I had no intention of remaining in the area. The day after the closing, their management team arrived to begin the transition. New signs appeared at all entrance points to the lake. Private property, Global Resorts International, access by reservation only. Security personnel in crisp uniforms began politely but firmly turning away Ridgeline residents who attempted to use the facilities with their now worthless Homeowners Association membership cards. The fallout within the Ridgeline estates was seismic. Property values, which had soared based on the lake amenities, plummeted by 60% overnight. Homeowners who had recently purchased at premium prices found themselves underwater on their mortgages. The Homeowners Association board, facing multiple lawsuits from residents, resigned en masse. Margaret Thornton, the architect of the entire debacle, put her mansion on the market and moved away before any legal proceedings could be initiated against her personally. The community that had once prided itself on exclusivity now found itself excluded from the very amenities they had created. Global Resorts International wasted no time implementing their vision for the property. The already luxurious facilities were further enhanced with a 5-star hotel, a championship golf course, and a helipad for wealthy guests arriving by private aircraft. Day passes for access to the facilities were priced at levels deliberately beyond what most Ridgeline residents could afford. Within a year, the resort was hosting celebrities, foreign dignitaries, and corporate retreats, generating revenues that justified the astronomical purchase price. The once peaceful lake that my grandfather had loved for its natural tranquility was now the centerpiece of a playground for the ultra-wealthy. In perhaps the most ironic twist, the Homeowners Association discovered another unpleasant surprise buried in county regulations. Having invested in permanent structures classified as community facilities, they remained legally responsible for contributing to their maintenance even after losing access to them. A portion of their Homeowners Association fees now went directly to Global Resorts International for infrastructure support and watershed management. Despite numerous legal challenges, this obligation remained in force, binding them to financially support a resort that actively excluded them. As for me, I purchased a modest but beautiful oceanfront property thousands of miles away where no homeowners association existed to dictate how I should live. The majority of my windfall went into establishing conservation trusts protecting undeveloped natural areas from precisely the kind of development that had transformed my lake. Occasionally, I received updates from former neighbors about the situation at Ridgeline Estates. The community never fully recovered from the loss of the lake amenities, and many original homeowners eventually sold at losses and moved away. A few attempted to reach out to express regret for not supporting me during the original conflict, but these overtures felt hollow, motivated more by the negative outcomes they had experienced than by genuine remorse. I stood on the deck of my new home, watching dolphins play in the distance, reflecting on the lessons of the lake. The Homeowners Association had been so focused on their grand vision that they failed to secure its foundation. They assumed that wealth and influence would override basic property rights, that the rules applying to others wouldn't apply to them. In their haste to create something impressive, they neglected the most fundamental step of making sure they had the right to build it in the first place. Sometimes, justice comes through force of will and direct confrontation. But sometimes, as in my case, it comes through patience, allowing those who would take what isn't theirs to invest their time, money, and reputation into something they can never truly possess. The poetic justice wasn't lost on me. They had attempted to appropriate my family legacy for their benefit. Instead, they had inadvertently made me wealthy beyond imagination while destroying the very community they sought to enhance. As the sun set over my new horizon, I felt no guilt for how things had unfolded. The Homeowners Association had built their dream on my land without permission. I had simply waited for the perfect moment to wake them from it,